So the whole purpose of this final panel is about advanced therapies for rare diseases. And thank you for staying with us. We're joined by a number of panelists, and in particular Emer from the European Medicines Agency. And really the whole area of advanced therapies in Ireland, when I started in IPOSI 9 years ago, the idea that Ireland could become a centre whereby new cell and gene therapies that were starting to come through at that time, that Ireland could actually develop a plan whereby these could be ultimately adopted into clinical service, into that clinical trials would become more available, but fundamentally that we would see it as an Irish strength and an asset, was probably pie in the sky, if I'm being honest, at that time. Whereas now, when you look at it and you actually appreciate just how many advanced therapeutic medicinal product trials that are actually happening in Ireland, and we'll hear about them from some of them from Martina. And when you look at the trajectory of where things are going now, that this is really happening now, and it really does need a national approach to how we make this much more relevant to an Irish context. So we're going to hear from Emer in terms of that European regulatory framework that's already in place and is producing results. And we're going to hear from Martina from St. James's campus that has already been conducting trials, and we'll hear about what the experience of that has been like. And I think Anne-Marie is still here with us, is she? Somewhere. Yes, down the back. So we'll hear from Anne-Marie in terms of, again, looking at this whole new technology, new area from a patient perspective in terms of how that patient voice can impact and influence the direction of travel by which these products are both produced, developed, assessed, and commercialized. So we'll then open it up for questions from the floor, but I will just keep it short and sweet, and I'll invite Emer to come up and to give us her perspective from the EMA. So Emer, you're most welcome, and look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Derek, and thanks very much to Vicky for inviting me today. I have to say, I always find experiences like this very humbling because I'm very Irish, but I haven't worked in Ireland for an awful long time, and I know very little really about the Irish ecosystem. So when I see the things that we do are really having an impact on how Ireland is bringing stuff together, I always feel very, very proud. Yeah, it's a real honor for me to be here today, and I want to thank Rare Disease Ireland for inviting me. Just to tell you a little bit about my journey with rare diseases, I have been working effectively in European regulatory affairs for some 30 years now. And in 1998, I went to work for the European Commission as a policy officer. And one of the jobs they gave me was take this orphan medicine regulation and make it into a regulation. And I said, well, I don't know anything about legislation. Actually, I'm a pharmacist. But I have to say I did, and the orphan medicines regulation that was adopted in 2000 is the result of a lot of running around and finding out things that I did back when I was a lot younger than I am now. And it was a very, very rewarding experience because it brought me into contact with patients, with developers who were struggling to get their voices heard, patients who were struggling to get their voices heard, patients who had no treatments, no options. And it really made me think, you know, how do we change? How do we make change happen in this area? So I did a lot of talking to the US, to different advocates at the time, learned a huge amount about the challenges. In the meantime, I realized that my father and two of my grandmothers were well, I don't know, the 3 and 17 or the number 17, but, you know, everybody is, if you look into it, you're closer than you think to somebody with a rare disease. So that was the start of my journey with the rare disease community, and now 25 years on, I haven't spent all my time working on rare diseases, but I'm in a position now as Executive Director of the European Medicines Agency where we do have a responsibility and an ambition to really make a difference here, and this is something that is very, very close to my heart. So we want to do what we can to advance the possibilities for patients having access to better medicines, and I think the whole area of advanced therapy medicinal products is an area where really there is a huge difference. So in the EU, there are more than 6,000 distinct rare diseases which affect around 26 million people. And I have to say, in those 25 years, I've seen huge advances in medicines and technology, and I really feel we're at the cusp of something special now with the technologies, the connectivity, you know, whereas when I started this, you know, you were trying to find out something about a disease. You're trying to find something about the incidence of a disease and you didn't even know where to start. You didn't even know where to find the experts involved. So now with the access to so much more data, the real challenge is how we bring it all together and make it work for us. And I think that's something you were trying to do in a lot of different ways, but it's core to what we have to do going forward. So I do feel it's a time of huge potential and that some of the promises will really move into realities. So I wanted to talk a little bit, before I talk about ATMPs specifically, I want to talk about the role the patients play in the work of the EMA, and then give you an insight into some of the specific initiatives and programs that we have to support the development of medicines for rare diseases. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the ATMPs in the pipeline. And then I think I couldn't finish without talking about collaboration and partnership. And this is something that you've heard about today. And just in the last session, you know, the challenges are more about bringing everybody together than what you can do in your own area. I always say, I know what I can do in my area, but that's all. But to make something happen, I need to know what I can do in multiple other areas for which I am not responsible. And I think we need to, you know, work on that together. But one of the most important the most important voice in our regulatory work is the voice of the patient. And we play a leading role in the facilitation and development and authorization of orphan medicines, but we need to know the real story from the people living or caring for people with these diseases, because I think you've heard nobody can be an expert in every single one of the rare diseases, but every patient is an expert, every carer is an expert, and we need to know how to bring that voice into the work of the regulatory system. We have been engaging with patients since we started in 1995, and in the beginning it was effectively informal discussion groups, but the orphan regulation changed the game because it brought in patients as members of our scientific committees. And this is one of the things, and I don't take any responsibility other than I pushed it through the statute books. It wasn't my idea, but it was a game changer in terms of involvement of patients in medicines regulation. And every single scientific committee created since the Orphan Medicines Committee has had patient involvement, and you will see that continue going on. So our interactions with patients has become a lot more formalized, and I think we've learned, patients have learned, and we've learned how to make the best, how we make the best of that expertise, and we use the expertise, the patient expertise, to contribute to the overall scientific knowledge. Eurodis, the EU Organization for Rare Diseases, which was actually Jan LeCam was our first committee member on the Orphan Committee back in 2000. And I think today is his last day in the post. And Eurodis is turning 18? 18? No. 20, it can't be. See, they don't give me the right notes here. I do think that, when we're looking at any medicine, but again, particularly medicines for rare diseases, we have to really understand the benefits and the risks and what matters. And sometimes we're guilty of being too academic about the benefits and risks. And when you ask a patient what matters to them, that's what matters to them. And it's not the hypothetical risks that we talk about. They might be prepared to take the risks, and we need to understand that. And it's truly great to see how patient groups are much more informed and knowledgeable, that they have influence, more tools to use, and it makes a huge difference to our work. It really helps to make it real. So I just want to say how important that is, and how important it is that you use your voice to make sure that the impact is meaningful. We involve patients in our risk assessments. We also use patient experience data to improve outcomes. You all know about the living with the disease and the treatments. And it's been a learning for us also, because I do remember the reticent with having involvement of patients in the regulatory work, because the scientists thought that it would be driven by emotion rather than science. And we had to get the balance right and really make sure that actually, yes, patients, people living with rare diseases, know more about these diseases than everybody else, and their voice needs to be heard. Now, I spoke a little bit about the patient experience data. Today, actually, we're doing a workshop with the EORTC looking specifically at patient-reported outcomes. It's in the cancer area, but we have a full-day workshop on patient-reported outcomes, and it's becoming much more part of the formal regulatory system. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is about the clinical trial system. We're trying to do work on improving the European ecosystem for clinical trials, making it less administrative, less bureaucratic, and trying to use the power of Europe to get more data and benefit. And we have an initiative which we call ACT-EU, Accelerating Clinical Trials in the EU, which has a number of different work streams. But one of them, I think, which is very important in the rare disease area is the use of decentralized clinical trials. And I'm always very struck by, thinking, when I think of how difficult it is for any patient to get access to clinical trials. And then you think of how difficult it is if you're a patient with a rare disease to have access to clinical trials. And it may be going on in Greece, or it may be going on in the US. So, but if you can try and use, you can try and systematize decentralized clinical trials, you can give greater access to patients. So we can use digital tools, we can use telemedicine, more mobile and local healthcare to collect information. And there are huge opportunities here that, again, we need to really build on and hear also the voice of the patient here to see what works and what doesn't work. The other area I wanted to touch on briefly was the whole area of real-world evidence. We have been investing heavily in getting feedback from real-world data sources. We've put in place a network of different data sources, the Darwin Data Analytics and Real-World Interrogation network, where we have data sources from some 30 different healthcare data sources. And we try and bring this together to give us better information about how treatments actually work in practice. But one of the challenges we have, and I was talking to somebody about this during the break, was that we need to have a common data model, because if you're looking at different healthcare data sets, and you want to use them effectively, you need to have common standards and be able to integrate them. And that's where the data that comes from a small country like Ireland, you want that data to be able to be used in a more international setting. So you have to also think about the data standards. So we use our real-world data sets to understand more about patient characteristics, treatment patterns. We can use it for epidemiology as well, but we're also working with the health technology assessment bodies really to look at, okay, so these products have been authorized. Most of the rare disease medicines will have been authorized on very little data. Now, how do they actually perform when you get into real life? And that's a very important question. It's an important question for the patients. It's an important question for the healthcare systems. Now, we can improve our chances of treating rare diseases by increasing the number of ATMPs with orphan designation. And between March 2023 and March 2025, we're expecting some 39 ATMP submissions. And the percentage of ATMP orphan designations went up last year to around 10%, from 10% to around 20%. So we're expecting and preparing to have a lot more applications in this area. So earlier this month, we recommended granting a marketing authorization for Quizodi, which is a treatment for ALS. And as you know, and I know we have, I think he might be gone now, but Jonathan from the SMA Association, I mean, a couple of years ago, we didn't have any treatments. Now we've got 3. So, and once you get a successful treatment, the chances of getting another successful treatment are much, much higher. But there are lots of challenges, not just because of the small data sets, and also because sometimes the applicants for ATMP trials and medicines have less experience with the regulatory system. So we're trying to also make sure that we provide the right information, that we do provide, that we anticipate the hurdles rather than to wait until the end of the system to say, oh well, you didn't do it right, because that's no good. That's no good for anybody. We have actually a pilot scheme that we're doing at the moment with non-commercial developers, where they benefit from enhanced support from us at the agency. The first participant that we selected for this pilot scheme was the Hospital Clinic of Barcelona, which was producing a CAR T-cell product for the treatment of patients with relapsed refractory acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And the second round of the pilot, which we finished in December, had a total of 11 candidates, and we were able to select 2 of these, and both of them were developing gene therapy products. And these are being developed by non-commercial sponsors, and we commit to doing effectively hand-holding to help them get through the system. So these are some of the ways that we're trying to address some of the complexities of the pathway from development to patients. We have an innovation task force which provides a forum for discussion on all aspects of medicine's development, on the scientific side, on the regulatory side, on the legal side. We have an office for small and medium-sized enterprises, which help, one of their jobs is to help to support academic startups and smaller companies that often perform the initial research on rare conditions. So we really have multiple systems in place to try and help to structure a program that will then meet the regulatory requirements further down the line. And as I speak, we're actually hosting a webinar, 1,000 people online at the moment, to celebrate Rare Diseases Day. It's an interactive webinar answering questions that developers and researchers have in the field about orphan designations, about rare disease developments, and we're encouraging everybody to participate, ask questions, interact with our experts. Now, obviously, you're listening to me and not this, but the video and the presentations will be available online after the event. So that's just a small snapshot of the work that we're doing, and it's only a small part of the journey of a development of a product that actually comes to a patient. But it gives you, I hope it gives you an idea of how we're approaching the challenges of rare disease and unmet patient needs in Europe. And we know the challenges. We know we have to do better. We know we have to be closer to the real challenges of patients, the challenges of developers. But because we know that if you're trying to find new treatments for rare diseases, you can't work on your own, and it's important that you collaborate closely with partners and stakeholders and patients. Also at the international level, we do a lot of work with the US FDA, and we've started a specific collaborative pilot now on developments for ultra rare diseases, where we're trying to share between the US. I think we're also involving Switzerland and Australia to again see how much we can do together, because we're all faced with the same challenge. If it's a rare disease, you have less data and you want more. I heard a lot today about the European reference networks, and I'm very proud that Ireland is so involved and active in this area, because these really do facilitate the discussions on complex or rare diseases, especially ones that require highly specialized treatment and concentrated knowledge and resources. So this just brings me to my final point on collaboration, and I think you've heard about this a lot during the day. We have our part to play as the European Medicines Agency. Patients you have your part to play as well. Developers have the part to play. But to be successful, we have to work together. And I find it really, really heartening to see that Ireland's strategy for rare diseases is taking shape. And I see that it has patients at the centre, and I think this is a very fundamental approach going forward. So if we're going to make progress in this area, and I truly believe that now is the time, then we have to do it across the multiple different ecosystems that we all live in ourselves, not just in our own. I know what I can do, but can you imagine how much we can do if we can all do this together? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emer. If you'd like to join me and Martina and Marie, if you'd like to come up. So again, thank you, Emer. Thank you for highlighting, first and foremost, the role that patients have played in EMA, and not just in terms of the scientific committees, but in terms of how it has evolved, I think, and the role that EMA plays now in that innovation ecosystem as a key partner. I think, to use the phrase used earlier, the question is now, how do we make that leap across those different ecosystems, with the patients very much at the center of it? And how do we then bring your experience? I'm also conscious that I probably have to ask you some tough questions, but if I think about when I read your profile, and it's like, so Emer was appointed in November 2020, and I think about maybe your first 100 days in that job. There's probably no question that I can ask that you haven't heard already, but or that you aren't capable of dealing with. But before I come to maybe the tougher questions, I'll ask maybe Martina.
Tough question. Lucky me.
So from what you've heard, from what Emer has outlined in terms of that regulatory environment, and maybe over the last few years of your experience of working with clinical trials in St. James's, and in particular the CAR-T cells and these new technologies, and the infrastructure that may or may not be there, how can you tell us what the reality is here?
Well, I think a lot of what Emer says is absolutely spot on, and you can definitely see the shift in European thinking to do all the things that you describe. Where I think the biggest challenge on the Irish side is the data. So you cannot be part of something if you cannot contribute to the data in a meaningful way. And we're really stuck here with our e-health strategy. I'm glad it's been published, but it has to be able to conform to the necessary sort of parameters to be useful in a research setting, you know, and to be contributable in a research setting. And we seem to be, perhaps we haven't expressed a big enough ambition for that, and for the levels of governance that need to come around that, and the data rules. And on that's on one side. And on the other side, we seem to be continually falling over ourselves with concerns, sometimes valid and sometimes not so valid, about GDPR, you know, which is inhibiting us putting forward data. You know, and maybe making people feel overly insecure about where that data is going. So I particularly was glad to hear Emer say that the patient's tolerance for risk when they have a very significant burden of disease is quite different, and it's very important to inform that patients inform, you know, their risk appetite for any given study. I know that was a very well-made point. The reality on the ground is that a decade ago, just as you say, we would have been sending people off to have, they would have been trying to find their own way, first of all, to the States perhaps, to get themselves into a trial, and they might have been spending 3 or 4 months there or longer with their family, trying to figure out how to continue their life while they were accepting rare treatments. And being part of clinical trials. And we did that all the way up till a few years ago, but I don't really believe that's necessary anymore. So for all, I mean, I would say I'm treating quite a number of rare diseases, maybe 14 or 15 at this stage. I'm not an expert in any of them, right? But I'm an expert in the complexity of delivering the advanced therapies and delivering the clinical trials. And there's some commonality in that complexity which we can build on and build an experience on that ensures that what's delivered to the patient at the end of the day is meticulously excellent. And that's the balance that this lady pointed out between trying to commit to personalization, committing to excellence is really what you're talking about, committing to excellence, but at the same time understanding how to achieve a level of integration so that it's manageable, you know. So I think that's the job for me, for Cecily in her strategy, is finding and wending that balance so that patients can get the best experience they can, including access to research.
Thank you. And can I probe you a little more, but just about the experience of running the CAR-T trials in the unit, and what that experience has been like?
It's been excellent. I mean, it was a very slow gestation, because there's an awful lot of work to do to determine that all of the resources are in place in that healthcare setting, in this case St. James's, to perform the trial. And then there needs to be, you know, the inclusions and the eligibility will be very tight. So a lot of patients will not meet the inclusion criteria for one reason or another. It might be nothing to do with them. It might be simply age. It might be something else. So there's a lot of hard work, and it takes 6, maybe 9 months before you can get into position to make a start to that kind of work. And then you have to travel, well, the patient travels a journey with you, so it's a real parity of esteem relationship when a patient comes into a trial, because they decide every single day that they come in, if they're going to come in the next day, and therefore are they going to continue in the trial. So the word that I would have put at the end of your informatics pieces there would be in charge. So that's the one thing I would add to that. So when you come into the clinical trial arena, to a great extent, the patient is in charge of what happens next, because they agree to continue every day. So we will have walked maybe an 8 or 9 month journey a second time with that patient while they undergo standard of care, because of course we must at the very minimum provide the best that we have available at a given time, and then before one can be randomized to go to the next step, perhaps into new drug X or orphan drug X, and then we follow that journey all the way through, sometimes for as long as 15 years, So it can be a very long time to have bad data. It can be a very great time to have great data if you can contribute it. So, and there's many times at which you might fall out, or perhaps have to leave the trial during that. But hopefully you go to the end, and you're very invested then, of course, in what happens, and to see it come around to its health technology assessment if it's a successful drug. But I couldn't overestimate the value of having Irish patients make their contribution to worldwide evidence. That is really significant, because then we have a much greater handle on how drugs will behave in an Irish population, what would it take for us to be able to deliver those drugs successfully to Irish patients. And when Irish patients make their contribution all the way along, that journey becomes an awful lot easier.
Thank you, Martina. That's great, and I will probably come back to you on a number of points, but you've actually segued quite nicely to Anne-Marie. And I guess from what, Anne-Marie, you've heard in terms of, Emer's described the patient experience data being increasingly part of the formal regulatory process. So the question then becomes, well, where is that data going to come from? I mean, Martina has described a kind of an ideal scenario where it comes from patients. But what can patient groups be doing to maybe ascertain, well, what are the outcomes maybe that are most relevant to your group, and how you might go about even collecting or even being the custodian of data that can help approval and ultimately availability of therapies.
Yeah, so I suppose my experience is at the Community Advisory Board. So I suppose that's the key for us in the organisation that I have been involved with. So so I mean it was really good to hear about the patient input in the EMA, and that's really important. And I suppose as I was hearing what Emer was saying, I was thinking, how does that trickle down to the HTA and to Ireland? And I suppose there's a sense of we're not really sure, I suppose. So it's fantastic, and that's what we want to hear about, what's happening in the EMA. But we're still struggling with that other piece. So I suppose from my experience, so I suppose I represent a charity called Cystinosis Ireland. I represent a couple of different organisations now, but the key one was Cystinosis Ireland, and what we got involved with a number of years ago was creating a community advisory board. And this is an international group of patient organisation leaders and members who have come together now in a formalised way to engage with industry for clinical trials, and to engage with researchers, early stage researchers, universities, around research in general. And we were originally mentored by Eurordis. We actually got the idea from a Eurordis meeting, because we were looking for something at the time that would help us to protect patients actually in clinical trials. We had some negative experiences of patients being taken off treatments, and industry at the time not engaging with us, and realizing that we were nobody on our own. It's a very rare disease. And so coming together meant that we actually saw a result there and an outcome. So that made us realize we need to come together as a group. And so the Community Advisory Board was set up. For us, I think, and you know, the mentorship for urologists at the start was really important. We're now autonomous on our own. And I suppose for us, to influence what's going on in clinical trials and research is the patient group has to be educated. And we did undertake a lot of education at the time. It was with urologists, where every month we met and we learned about clinical trials, HTAs, EMA, FDA, pipeline, all of that. And the group met every month, studied in between, and, you know, really built up their knowledge, so that it meant that when we came to talk to industry, they could talk with confidence, but also could bring the patient experience and the family experience. And so there was no wool pulled over our eyes when we met with industry to talk about endpoints and all of that. Patient-reported outcomes is an interesting one, and we've struggled with that, in that and it's exactly as Emer said, what's important to the patients isn't always important to the people that we met, or not that it wasn't important, but it didn't seem to matter because it wasn't going to get it over the line for them to get they felt their market approval, or maybe even more importantly, HTA approval. So that's the thing we're still struggling with, actually, and patient-reported outcomes and what is really important to the patients. Quality of life is like, for all of us, is the key. And, you know, a patient doesn't want to be on a treatment that doesn't work. That goes without saying, you know. So, you know, they want it to work, they want the quality of life. In relation to the CAB as well, the CAB is autonomous. It has, you know, and it's independent. It sets the agenda for these meetings with industry when we meet with them. So I suppose, yeah, if I'm answering your question, an educated patient group, equal partners in the discussion, and what the patient group brings is seen as valuable and is used, and how it's used afterwards, and the transparency and of where it's used, and, you know, a lot of work is put into that, and the patient group would need to see the outcome and where their work has been influential. Yeah.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And if I can even follow that up, and I know that, you know, that you've been involved with the Technology Review Group for orphan medicinal products in Ireland for a number of years, and without divulging any or crossing any confidentiality issues, what has that experience been like? If you're able to tell us, as a patient advocate.
Yeah, myself and Avril were both the patient advocates on that. It's been a really interesting experience, actually. I suppose the first thing you'd need to say is that if you're going in there, you need to be able to stand your ground with the rest of them as well. You know, you need, again, the education is important, going in as a patient representative. I suppose what I would say, and this is more personal than anything else, what I saw as influential is the patient voice in there. And it sounds almost cliche to be saying that, I think. But what we did notice, that if there was a treatment for a really rare disease that didn't have an organised patient organisation, it was much more difficult to get the information. You're kind of trying to get maybe one person, and I know, you know, the group did try very hard to get that piece. So if you haven't got an organised patient group organisation, it's probably a bit more difficult. And of course now you can go internationally as well, but it's like what you said, Martina, you know, the Irish authorities want to hear the Irish experience. The clinician input was really important too, because if you don't have a patient organisation, actually you'll have a clinician somewhere that's looking after that patient, and they do become expert and knowledgeable, even if it isn't their first specialty. And I think and they are good advocates for the patients. That would be the other thing I would say. You know, I think in preparing for this, Vicky had said one of the questions I'll be asked is the barriers to access. And I suppose, I have to say it, even though we're not supposed to talk about money, but it's the barrier. It's the number one barrier. It's the elephant in the room. And as a patient organisation and as patients, you know, we're at the mercy of the industry on one side, who, you know, is setting the price of the treatments. And at the mercy of the health authorities on the other side, who don't want to pay. And at the end of the day, you know, we're caught in the middle, and that's something that needs to be addressed. And I suppose the only one point I'd make was great to hear the Minister saying there was 30 million for new treatments down the track. But, you know, the government gave 95 million to the greyhound industry last month. So, you know, Avril and somebody else talked about the how you judge a society and how you look after your vulnerable people. So, we have to think about that too. And it is the biggest barrier at the moment, isn't it? Yeah.
It's a great point, and I'm glad you made it, because certainly I think in my experience of working with maybe the health economists of the world, that certainly when health economists ask society and ask patients and the public, you do our job for us. You weigh up these kind of things, and you tell us which you prefer. Would you prefer to invest X amount in X treatment that will treat thousands of people, or this very specialized treatment that comes with a price tag for this very small population? And they're consistently surprised when the patients and the public come and recognize the value of investing in those that are probably the most underserved by the process. So how you judge that is, I think, where ATMPs are going to fall, really, because they will come with price tags. It's then how do you create an ecosystem that actually recognizes that as not the ultimate barrier for adoption. So, and I'm struck by some of the comments made about the clinical expertise and the education of the healthcare professionals as well, and also the ancillary services around how these new technologies are adopted. Is there any work being done in that whole area, maybe Lisa or Martina?
Well, there's quite a bit of work around, first of all, values-based healthcare, and looking at how that cost stacks up over life and over the durability of the treatment, and that's been good. And I would say that we had a good start, for example, with drugs like Zolgensma for spinal muscular atrophy, where if it's given early, you can see very dramatic improvements that, you can see how that stacks up well in terms of the value then of not having to provide excessive levels of healthcare or very high levels of healthcare, complicated healthcare for a child who's treated. You can see similarly good stories in the haemophilia story, because, factor is so expensive in itself that anything that adds significant benefit and reduces the need for additional drugs and improves the patient's quality of life, it's hard not to be impressed, by that. But then there is as well a need to think about, we shouldn't be thinking about every new advanced therapy as if it was a new event. We have to come to the point of being able to think about what we need by way of fixed costs, to support that infrastructure, and then additional costs depending on the nature of the disease, how rare it is, how complicated the drug is, and so on. So because when you have the fixed infrastructure, the cost per patient each time is reduced. It's better, So you have to see it in that sort of way. So, and there's a whole piece of work being done by people in this room around Ireland's readiness for advanced therapies, and not just its readiness in the clinical scenarios and in the clinical trials, but also our readiness in terms of adoption, in terms of delivery, in terms of pricing, in terms of dispensing, in terms of follow-up. So there's a whole big piece of work to be done around that. But, we always say that Ireland can be the home of the pilot, the porta-cabin, and, the interim solution, So, and this, I would say, is an area where maybe the short-term solution is not going to be helpful. We need to think very long-term. We need to be looking ahead 10, 15, 20 years into what we need. So, for example, there are 6 clinical research facilities in the country, but none of them are funded as core funding. They're all funded by grants. And there's many research programs, and there's research programs coming in cellular treatments, but they are all funded as programmatic grants. So we need to get to the point where there is a recognition that this is going to be part of our future, and we really need to start getting ready for it. Sure, I think you would agree with that, would you? Hopefully you would.
So you're making my job very easy here when you mention readiness, because I can pivot. So, Emer, from what you've heard, both today, I think, but also from our panelists, on that readiness piece, have you seen other countries who have gotten much more ready, much more quickly when it comes to ATMPs? I was struck by a report that came out from the UK recently. I think that they did invested heavily in their readiness, whereas in Ireland it seems to be less. Well, certainly what I've seen so far has been more on the manufacturing capability side, rather than maybe the readiness of the system to adopt this in terms of both. I guess that's juxtaposed research and clinical care together. And that's what I think you've just described. So have you seen any examples from other countries coming through?
Well, to be honest, I'm not really, I don't know exactly how it happens in other countries either, so I can't really tell you. You do see some good examples, but they're usually just examples. I think the idea of having, I mean, we're seeing now a lot of strategies for rare diseases. I think there were 23 or something across Europe. So people are thinking about it. I mean, when I started, this didn't happen. This didn't happen, and it's not going to happen overnight. You know, if you think about all the challenges that you have. And yes, maybe Ireland has more of a focus on you know, promoting manufacture, but what we just heard from Martina now in terms of clinical trials, that's pretty impressive, isn't it?
Certainly.
So I would say I don't think Ireland is an outlier. I think it's well on the track to be a good European performer. Money is always going to be the issue. The resources to make these things happen is always going to be the issue, and it's about choices in healthcare systems as well. So I don't have any insight into. I wouldn't be able to tell you this country is the poster child. I mean, some countries where you have a very interconnected system, it's much easier. But then I'd go to Singapore. You know, Singapore, I think, they get data from their healthcare systems, from their clinical trials. They have, it's a rich country, you know, so there are a lot of things that can happen quite quickly. I think small countries, you can do that, but then you're limited by the data set.
We're back to data. So I'm conscious as well that there's another event happening today on clinical trials for rare diseases. It's up in Malahide, and it's going on tomorrow. So for anyone who wishes to continue this conversation, it might be well worth getting up to Malahide. But there are those, I hate using this word, but pockets of expertise emerging in Ireland around this, and many of them are in the room. So if anybody wishes to raise a hand and ask a question, I'd be happy to receive those. There's a mic going around. I know there's two hands there, one from Alan, and I think there was maybe, yeah.
I have a question for Emer, but I'll give the context first. For me, rare diseases are split into 4 categories. You have common rare, medium rare, rare, and ultra rare. And for the rare and ultra rare, for me, funding for research has been waning for a number of years, and certainly investment by companies has been waning for a number of years. And to try and reinvigorate that, my one wish to the EMA will be to try and create a priority review voucher like what the FDA have, and I think it will be a complete game changer in terms of investment for therapy development and even basic research if there's good proof of concept in rare and ultra rare diseases. So I just wonder if you have any comments on the possibilities. I'm sure you've thought of this before. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. I think that was a direct question to Emer, but
Well, it was a direct question to me, but just to be absolutely clear, it would not. It's not something that EMA can do. This would have to get on the legislative books, and then we would be able to apply it. But that's a question for the legislator. And I wouldn't be too hopeful at the moment, because we have at the moment there is a voucher at the moment on the statute books for AMR, which is getting a lot of challenging response. So if that was to be successful, I would say there might be a chance in the future in the rare disease area. But if I was being a careful advocate, I wouldn't put it in on the table right at the moment.
Question from Avril.
Thank you. Thank you. I also have another question for Emer. Sorry. But you mentioned something in your talk, I think that was really interesting and maybe interesting to many of the patients in the room, about a new, I think, a pilot discussion between yourselves at the EMA and the FDA. In the context of your question, Derek, around data, a lot of patient organizations now are preparing for the advent of therapies. They're listening to you and others who are decision makers, essentially, about what type of data we should be gathering, particularly in the context of patient-reported outcome measures, you know, etc. So, in your discussions with the FDA, is there are diversities of approach, let's just say, in how we accept these particular PROMs and other endpoints, but you know, sticking with PROMs for the moment, is it possible to have those discussions so that we can arrive at some form of uniformity? Because all of us here, we're talking about this in the Irish context, but our research is not only European, but it's global. And so this is something that we as patients are concerned with right now. So just wondering if that's something that's on your agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working on international collaboration pretty much my entire regulatory life, and honestly, I am absolutely passionate about us trying to make life simpler internationally. But I will also say it's not as easy as you think it would be. Because there are different contexts that once you dig and you see, you try to understand why things are done differently. You also see that there are different healthcare contexts that make a difference. There are different standards of care that make a difference. But the good thing is these things are discussed, and they're tried to, you have an, our experts are trying to say, okay, well, what is the best way? Not just what is the way we do it, but you know, if we look at it on from a global setting, what's the best way? How can we serve patients best? How can we get the best medicines for patients? So these discussions do go on. They go on very much at an expert level, but they're complex.
Struck by Martina's point about the commonality of complexity, and if that's a quote I can use. David. Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick, thanks for that, Emer. And just a quick one, because I was conscious I spoke earlier on, but just really, you're drawing it out there, the experience in the room. Martina's touched on it. It's so difficult to get these things up off the ground in Ireland. All it is a triumph for perseverance. And somebody, our minister alluded to this earlier on, someone who perseveres is an irritant as well, so you create a lot of enemies along the way, but we're doing it for patients. But when you hit other things that are very frustrating, so I don't really need a comment, but I think Martina's lived this, and Marie sort of has watched it, and Emer's well aware, and you're aware, Derek. To be close to setting something up and waiting for the approval to come through, and you touched on this about funding being a barrier, and I would have said that until last year, when 3 or 4 patients who would have been suitable for a gene therapy treatment for an eye disease are signed off for the treatment abroad scheme while we wait for the approvals to come through in our country, is a real kick in the gut to all those who work really hard to try and get it over the line. So it's just sort of a statement of frustration, if anybody's sort of aware of that, into the room. We're ploughing on regardless, and Bettina's been so helpful in us setting that up and really highlighting that point about that collaboration, because we're a small island, but really to say that there are multiple barriers along the way, but not all of them are financial. And I fail to understand why some decisions like that would be made. To be honest, to avoid a row, I didn't write any letters or anything through. The children were looked after, main thing. They're doing really well. and they'll come back in under our care, and we've looked to put them onto the post-licensing treatment here. But we're losing that information, that experience for Irish patients. We would have the expertise now of treating 6 eyes in 3 patients rather than starting now as we are in 6 weeks or 8 weeks' time with our first patient. All these are missed opportunities.
I would say I very much agree with you. And we really need a mandate to collaborate. You know, we need to be told it's okay to collaborate, and that in that collaboration it's okay to break down mad barriers that are in the way, including some mad geographical barriers that are in the way. You know, so if, for example, you know, can a patient who's always been looked after in the Mater be looked after in St. James's, or vice versa? Can a patient from the north come down to the south to access something, so that they can get a greater level of expertise and experience, perhaps, and one of our patients go to the north? That happens in practice, but often, unfortunately, you know, it's not necessarily it's not as overt as it should be. You know, the accessibility mechanisms.
Very interesting in the current political environment in terms of All Ireland collaboration and maybe the appetite for that.
Yeah, well, it certainly should be. I mean, it should be the case.
Easier for us to collaborate sometimes with Belfast than it will.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't see any other hands in the air, but I do see Vicky at the back of the room going, thank goodness we've got to 5 o'clock, and we're thereabouts. So, like I said, there's more to be said on this topic, but there are green shoots of opportunity. So, in keeping with that, I would just like to thank all of the panelists, and I'll hand over to Vicky for the final words.